This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 443 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to send another reminder about the FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League for the Masters. For just $5, you'll have a chance to build a team around the biggest names in golf and compete for your share of the $1,000 prize pool, including a $125 first place prize. To enter, visit FanDuel.com/league/PGA Listener League. Eligibility restrictions apply. Buy Derrick Henry. So Henry didn't have the best game in the world against Chicago this past week, where he rushed for 68 yards, he didn't find the end zone, and he didn't see a single target. But now's the time to buy Derrick Henry, and here's why. This was just the second time this season where we've seen Henry finish outside the top 15 in weekly running back scoring. And that's in PPR formats. It was also the first time that he didn't have a target in a game. And it feels like we haven't talked about this enough this year. But even after having 0 targets this past week, he has a 7.4% target share this year. Now that's not great. That's not an amazing target share for a running back. But his highest single season target share came last year and it was 5.9%. Prorated to 16 games, it was 6.3%. So he's more involved in this offense as a receiver this year. Now here's the thing. We know that historically Derrick Henry has been a running back who really thrives in November and December. That narrative alone might make it a little bit difficult to trade for him. But his playoff schedule this year is unbelievable. And given the fact that he had this down game, I can't just ignore that. I can't ignore this transaction. You have to at least try to buy Derrick Henry this week. Because listen to this fantasy football playoff schedule. He gets the Jags, the Lions, and the Packers. Those 3 teams each rank as top 6 matchups for running backs according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Derrick Henry is probably going to win some leagues this year. Do what you can to buy him now after this bad outing. Sell Ezekiel Elliott. Maybe this one seems kind of obvious. Maybe selling Zeke is an obvious transaction. But let's dig through this. Before Dak Prescott suffered his season-ending injury, Elliott was averaging 22 PPR points per game. He had a running back rush share per game of about 88%, a target share per game of 13.5%. He was an RB1 in fantasy football. Since that injury, Elliott has watched his running back rush share go to 62%. That's a massive dip, and his target share per game has dropped by 2.5%. But he also hasn't found the end zone, so he's only averaging 8.8 PPR points per game without Dak Prescott. You know, in most cases like this, I would just say, ride it out. And honestly, at this point, you might have to. But if you can find another league manager who's willing to buy into his name, to buy into Ezekiel Elliott, I think you should try to shop him. Because not only is his usage declining, and not only are the scoring opportunities declining, but from now through the end of the fantasy season, guess which team in the NFL has the worst schedule for running backs when we look at adjusted fantasy points allowed? The Cowboys. Now, some teams are close, but I'm pointing out here that the rest of the season is not a cakewalk for this offense and for Zeke in particular. Maybe you can sell the fact that Garrett Gilbert looked competent and pretty good against the Steelers this past Sunday. Maybe you can just say the running back position sucks, and look, Zeke is getting some volume. It's hard to find volume at the running back position. I think there are at least ways to make Ezekiel Elliott look decent. So I would use that when I'm negotiating. But yes, overall, as an idea, I don't really want Ezekiel Elliott on my fantasy football teams. Buy Tom Brady. So you guys know this, but I'm not typically someone who buys quarterbacks in fantasy football. I don't like trading for quarterbacks. It's a relatively replaceable position. There's guys on the waiver wire each week who are usable. There's no need to really go out and buy a quarterback. But with Tom Brady, after his performance against the Saints, you might not have to give up all that much to get him. I'm cool with sending some bench pieces for Tom Brady. He had 209 yards and he was picked 3 times against the Saints. It was his worst fantasy performance of the season. And it was the first time that he scored single-digit fantasy points since facing Carolina in week 2. But the reason that you're buying him right now, there's 2 reasons. The first is that we know that he has a supporting cast, and a good supporting cast. Antonio Brown, in his first game, he looked pretty good. He actually led that team in air yards too. But the main reason that you're buying Brady, you guessed it, it's the schedule. Specifically, it's the playoff schedule. In Week 14, Tampa Bay gets Minnesota. That's a neutral matchup in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. Week 15, they get Atlanta. We know Atlanta is awesome for quarterbacks. That's the most advantageous matchup when you look strictly at the last 5 weeks. And then across the entire season, they're the second best matchup. And then in Week 16, which is championship week, they get the Lions. Detroit has been the 4th best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted points allowed over the last 5 weeks, when you only look at how they've performed over the last 5 weeks. So when you bring it all together, you're going to want pieces of this Tampa Bay passing attack in the fantasy playoffs. The problem is we don't know how targets are going to be divvied up amongst their wide receivers and their tight end, Rob Gronkowski. So instead of guessing, which I would argue Antonio Brown is probably the best one to buy right now, just given where the market is on him, but instead of trying to guess, just get the quarterback. Capture all of that in one player, and that one player is Tom Brady. So after this bad game, I think he's an easy trade target this week. Hold or buy Ronald Jones. Okay, so speaking of the Buccaneers, Ronald Jones has not been playing all that much over the last 2 weeks. In Week 8, the Bucs had him on the field for just 24% of the team's snaps. That was a season low. And then on Sunday, that number was 32%, his second lowest snap share of the year. But I don't look at data blindly. I watch games. I watch every single game. I like to give data context. And in this case, we need that context badly. In that Week 8 game against the Giants, Ronald Jones was seeing the early game work. On the first drive, he outtouched Leonard Fournette 4-0. And then at the start of the second Bucs drive, Jones got another carry. And then on the very next play, Ronald Jones got a target. He caught the ball and he quickly fumbled. And then it became a Leonard Fournette game. And then against the Saints on Sunday, we saw a similar type of trend. Jones opened the game as a starter, he played as the main running back, and he played as the main running back well into the second quarter. And then the game got out of hand. So the Bucs threw their pass catching back onto the field. That's Leonard Fournette. That's not Ronald Jones. Fournette then saw 6 targets. Now Fournette's now hit 6 targets in each of his last 3 games. So make no mistake, Leonard Fournette is the pass catching back on this team. And you guys know that I like targeting pass catchers more than non-pass catchers at the running back position. I'm bringing all this up today, though, because plenty of fantasy managers are going to look at the end result of these Buccaneers games, and they're going to assume that Leonard Fournette is the clear-cut back in this Tampa Bay backfield. But that's not really the case. Evidence doesn't tell us that that's the case. What seems to be going on is that Ronald Jones is the early down starter. He's the guy that they're going to feature in a friendlier game script. Fournette is probably the safer option, don't get me wrong. These transactions, though, aren't just about liking one player better than the other. It's fine to like Leonard Fournette, but if the market is also liking Leonard Fournette, you're not extracting value. And to me, there's some value to be extracted right now with Ronald Jones. As I just talked about with Tom Brady, the Buccaneers' playoff schedule looks pretty good. That could end up helping Jones. If there's a positive game script, he's probably the running back that's going to benefit. And since he's had 2 straight down games, it shouldn't be that hard to acquire him. Hopefully you can just use assets that are on your bench to get Ronald Jones right now. But at the very least, just hold on to him. Don't be totally scared off from these last 2 weeks. And this is coming from someone who hasn't been a Ronald Jones guy. I think that he's a low-key buy candidate right now for very, very cheap. Add Duke Johnson. So David Johnson suffered a concussion during the first quarter of Houston's game against Jacksonville on Sunday. That allowed Duke Johnson to grab hold of a huge workload in that backfield. Duke handled 89% of the Texans' running back rushes. He had a 13.3% target share. That helped him finish with 15.3 PPR points. He was a top 10 running back in Week 9. So if David Johnson misses any time, Duke Johnson becomes a fantasy football starter. Buy Dallas Goedert. So I've been talking about the Eagles' passing attack for weeks now. I talked about adding Dallas Goedert when he was coming off IR. I've been talking about Travis Fulgham and Jalen Reagor. And a lot of that has to do with their upcoming schedule. They get the Giants, Browns, Seahawks, Packers, Saints, Cardinals, and Cowboys through the end of the fantasy football season. There's the potential for a lot of high-scoring games there. But I'm bringing up Goddard specifically this week because, number one, the tight end position sucks. A lot of you guys need tight ends. But number 2, before the bye, he had a game where he didn't do a whole lot production-wise. So you're hypothetically buying Dallas Goedert low. In that game, he had a 4% target share. He had 1 catch for 15 yards. But let's not lose sight of what Goedert did earlier this season. The first 2 weeks of the season when he was healthy, he had about a 20% target share in that Eagles offense. He had 131 receiving yards and a touchdown. But in that Week 8 game against Dallas, he still ran a route on over 80% of Carson Wentz's dropbacks. It's not as though Philadelphia was like holding him back. He just didn't put together a great game coming off an injury. That happens all the time. So given the schedule, given the tight end position as a whole, and given the fact that he's coming off of that game, I think Goedert is a good buy candidate. Add or buy Austin Hooper. So like I was just saying, the tight end position is a dumpster fire. A lot of you guys need help at tight end. So I figured that I would throw some recommendations out there this week to give you that help. Austin Hooper, I think, might be an ideal type of target at tight end to buy right now. He's coming off that appendicitis, which sucks. I got my appendix removed before, TMI. But he's done with the appendicitis. He should be back here in week 10. And don't forget, before that appendicitis, he was averaging almost a 20% target share per game for Cleveland. And that's after seeing just 5.7% of the team's targets in week 1. Now OBJ is out. He's done for the year. That could open things up. And Cleveland has one of the best schedules for fantasy tight ends through the end of the fantasy season when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Austin Hooper is still available in 60% of Yahoo leagues. If he's out there, you should be adding him. He gets good usage in this offense. But even if he's not, throw a bench player in a trade and see if you can upgrade your tight end position. Add Kalen Ballage. This is the most 2020 thing of all time, that Kalen Ballage is being added to fantasy rosters. But after Justin Jackson left during the first drive of the Chargers-Raiders game on Sunday, I'm still tilting over that, Kalen Ballage carried the ball 15 times for 69 yards and a touchdown. I'm not going to say it. And he caught 2 of 3 targets for 15 yards through the air. And he had 62.5% of the Chargers running back rushes when that game was over. He had pretty good usage. So depending on the severity of that Jackson injury, we could actually get usability from Kalen Ballage again. I can't believe I'm saying that. Sell Will Fuller. Look, if you drafted Fuller, you might not want to get rid of Fuller right now. I totally get it. He was a huge value, and you've been benefiting all season long. He's now a top 15 wide receiver in points per game, and he's been really consistent. He's finished as a top 30 wide receiver in 6 of 8 games. So when I say sell Will Fuller, I'm not saying sell Will Fuller for anyone. I'm just saying that he has seen a slight target share dip over his last 2 games. He's averaged a 16.2% target share over his last 2. During the 4 games before that, it was 23.4%. And guys, I would be shocked, or at least very, very surprised, if Will Fuller is able to maintain his touchdown scoring rate. He's now scored a touchdown in each of his last 6 games. If you look at how many yards it's taken an average wide receiver to score a touchdown over the last decade, and keep in mind, as I always say on this podcast, yards do correlate to touchdowns. But based on Will Fuller's yardage total, he's been exceeding touchdown expectation by 2.4 touchdowns this year. That's one of the highest marks in the league. And it's not just that simple conversion that's showing that. Pro Football Focus has an expected touchdown model, and it's showing the exact same thing. It's giving you almost identical results. But not only that, the Texans don't have the best schedule in the world moving forward. It's a bottom 10 one for wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed. And in the fantasy playoffs, Houston gets the Bears, Colts, and Bengals. That's nothing special. So I think right now might be the time to sell Will Fuller. Add Matt Breida and Savon Ahmed. So the Dolphins had their first game without Myles Gaskin this past week. And I would say it went sort of as expected. They split the backfield. Jordan Howard saw the highest running back rush share at 55.6%, but Jordan Howard is dust. He had 10 carries for 19 yards. And then Patrick Laird was the only one to have a target out of the backfield. But then there was rookie Savon Ahmed. He actually led the backfield in snaps with a 45.9% snap share. He carried the ball 7 times for 38 yards. According to NumberFire's expected points model, he had the best success rate on that team, or versus Jordan Howard. His success rate was 43%, Howard's was 30%. So Achman might be more of a deeper league or maybe a dynasty ad this week, but he should be on your radar. But if Matt Breida is able to return from this hamstring injury that he's dealing with, I would prefer him. I think he has the most intriguing workload upside because we've seen him be efficient in the past, and we've also seen him be effective as a receiver. He has that skill set. So just keep an eye on where things are at throughout the week. Add J.D. McKissic. So on Sunday, McKissic saw 35.9% of Washington's targets. That was the second highest target share that any running back has seen this season. And naturally, it came when Captain Checkdown entered the game, that being Alex Smith. Now, since Kyle Allen could be done for the year, Smith is probably going to keep quarterbacking this Washington team. And if that happens, McKissic really might benefit. He has a 17% target share across this season. That might be a little bit more sustainable with Alex Smith. So I think that he's a cheap PPR option who should give you a high floor each week. Buy Sterling Shepard. Since Sterling Shepard returned from injury, he's seen target shares of 27.5%, 24.4%, and 24.2%. He's turned that into fantasy performances of 17.9, 15.4, and 11.7 PPR points. Sterling Shepard is not a sexy fantasy asset, but he's getting the job done. That's what he does. So for anyone needing relatively cheap production at wide receiver in the short term, maybe for a playoff push, I think that Shepard is your guy. Because over the Giants' next 4 games, they get the Eagles, Bengals, Seahawks, and Cardinals. Those are some pretty good matchups. Add Baker Mayfield. I think the top quarterback streamer this week is Mayfield. Cleveland gets Houston in a game with a 53.5 point over-under right now, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And the Browns are favorites. They have a really high implied team total. And Houston's secondary is beatable. They let Jake Luton tear them up on Sunday, and on the season they rank as a fringe top 10 opponent in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So I think Baker Mayfield is a very solid start. Add Tua Tagovailoa. We have an awesome matchup this week with the Chargers facing off against the Dolphins because we get Justin Herbert against Tua. That game is projected to be close. There's a 2.5 point spread. The over-under is a pretty reasonable 48.5. And it was good to see Tua not in this crazy positive game script on Sunday. We saw that in his debut. The Dolphins went up early. They didn't need to rely on Tua to get things done. But against the Cardinals, that wasn't the case. And he looked pretty good. This week, then, he gets a Chargers secondary that's allowed the 6th most adjusted fantasy points per game to opposing fantasy quarterbacks. I think he's a decent fallback plan if you can't get Mayfield this week. Add the Minnesota Vikings defense. So look, you can go in a lot of different directions at defense this week in terms of streaming. Like if Philadelphia is sitting on your waiver wire, you can go for them. I would go with Philly over Minnesota. But Minnesota right now is rostered in just 23% of Yahoo leagues. So I figured they would be usable for a lot of you listening to this. But they face Chicago this week. Chicago's been sort of an average matchup this year for opposing defenses, but they've been safe. They're a safe target. Since week 1, only the Panthers' defense was unable to finish in the top 16 in weekly scoring against the Bears. And over the last 3 weeks, we've seen 3 top 8 performances from defenses going up against Chicago. Is that shocking? Not at all. The Chicago offense is not very good. So with this game having a pretty low over-under, Minnesota's a favorite. I like the Vikings defense as a streamer. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my weekly 50 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to buy Mark Andrews. Now, I don't feel amazingly confident in this one, but I wanted to give another tight end take on today's show because, again, I know how awful the position is for a lot of you guys. Andrews has been really bad in fantasy. He's scored 4, 6, and 5 PPR points over his last 3 games. He's scored fewer points per game since week 5 than Tyler Kroft, Adam Troutman, and Cole Kmet, just to name a few. But Andrews' target share really hasn't been all that bad. Even if you just look at straight targets, because we know Baltimore is a run-heavy team, he's seen 4, 6, and 5 targets over his last 3 games. No, that's not amazing, but it's not horrific at tight end either. Now, over this time frame, the Ravens haven't targeted Andrews once in the end zone. He had 7 end zone targets across his first 5 games. That's one of the key differences in why he's not producing. He's not getting it done in the touchdown column. But number 1, the offense struggled against a good Steelers defense a couple of weeks ago, and they faced Indianapolis this past week, who ranks 3rd best in adjusted points allowed to tight ends this year. So number one, overall, the schedule has not been ideal. And then number two, this just goes back to what I talked about last week. Don't lose sight of the Ravens' schedule in the fantasy playoffs. They'll get Cleveland, Jacksonville, and the New York Giants. None of those matchups are crazy easy or crazy hard for tight ends, but they're matchups where Baltimore can score points. Now, don't get me wrong here. The reason I wanted to make this the 16th transaction this week is because, like I said, I don't feel amazingly confident about this transaction. I don't want it to be taken out of context for the headline readers out there. What I really think you should do is just see if you can get Mark Andrews for cheap. Don't give away a starter. Don't give away a usable piece. When it comes to players who are producing at this low of a level, you shouldn't just be buying the name. You need to be buying production too. But I do think that with the upcoming schedule and the schedule that Baltimore just faced, it makes some sense to think that Andrews has a chance to bounce back a little bit. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.